Okay, welcome back. Here we go. Next video for our poster notes finishes it up here. Things we need to write on our poster notes. First, we're going to write about the tides. And what you really need to know is that at the new moon and at the full moon, we have spring tide. So you want to just write that there at new moon and full moon, write spring tide. And then at first quarter and third quarter, we want to write neap tide. Just like that. First quarter, neap tide. On the other side, third quarter, neap tide. And I will tell you what the abbreviations are right there in just a moment. So as we discussed in our Zoom class the other day, the tides have names, the spring tide and the neap tide, and they don't have anything to do with the seasons, like the spring tide. But what it does have to do with is the gravitational pull of the sun and the moon on the earth. The sun's mass is so much more, but the distance is so much further that it has about the same amount of pull on our tides as the moon does, with a smaller mass but closer distance. And when we're talking about gravitational pull, those are factors that matter: mass of the objects and the distance between the objects. So in this case, when it is full moon or new moon, the tides work together. And what they do, what happens is the sun pulls, and like with the full moon, and the moon pulls, and they kind of pull in opposite directions there, almost a tug of war, and it kind of stretches both land and water, but more the water, out, so that we have higher high tides at the beach and lower low tides. There's a larger range between them. So the spring tide has higher high tides and lower low tides. Now the same thing happens in the new moon phase when they're both pulling this way, because if you pull this way, it's going to pull the sides in a little bit, and it's going to then stretch this side out here. So we've got, again, gravitational pull of the moon and the sun are kind of shaping things like this. And we have higher high tides, lower low tides, or HT, higher high tides, and LLT, lower low tides. So higher high tides, lower low tides are the spring tides. And I always remember that by thinking about how you can take if I take a spring and squish it, and it'll bounce back out big. All right? So lower low tides, like really compressing the spring, higher high tides, that spring bouncing out, and it's kind of a straight line. The way they're lined up in syzygy is a straight line to where they are working together to pull. The other one, neap tide, N-E-A-P, they are working against each other. So in the neap tide, you've got the sun here going up, the earth here, and the moon here. You've got a 90-degree angle, and they're working against each other. And that's going to give us lower high tides and higher low tides, or LHT and HLTs. Lower high tides and higher low tides, meaning the range between the tide is not as far. And we do remember, the tides change approximately every 6 hours from high tide to low tide. high tide to high tide is 12 hours. Low tide to low tide is 12 hours. 6 hours between. So it goes high tide, low tide, high tide, low tide, high tide, low tide, in that order. Now in between, when we're in the waxing crescent, waxing gibbous, waning gibbous, and waning crescent phases, it's just normal tides. And that is how the moon affects the tides. And it's the moon and the sun. They partner up on that. The next thing that happens, okay, so what we want to do then is write, we want to write at each one, at new moon, spring tide, and I'm just going to abbreviate HHT, higher high tides, LLT, lower low tides. Same thing up at the full moon. The spring tide happens, and I'm going to write HHT, and I'm going to write LLT, higher high tides, lower low tides. At first quarter, I'm going to write neap tide, NEAP, and I'm going to put LHT, and I'm going to put HLT, lower high tides, higher low tides, and then over here at the last quarter, or the third quarter, I'm going to write again neap tide, and I'm going to write LHT, and I'm going to write HLT, lower high tides, higher low tides. In the next video, we will talk about eclipses.